So apparently we've got a little bit more of an understanding on why the Pac-12 turned into the diaper fire of college football. Brett McMurphy, who covers college football for the Action Network, he sent out a tweet. Brady McCullough, who's an LA Times reporter covering the Pac-12 and just the demise of the Pac-12, and had this to say. George Kolovkov, who's the Pac-12 commissioner, tried blocking UCLA's move to the Big Ten with Cal Regents. Then in October 2022, ESPN offered Pac-12 $30 million a school, but a Pac-12 president, quote, worked with a professor on his campus who estimated the school's market value was $50 million. So the Pac-12, based on this professor's advice, asked for $50 million a school, and ESPN said, now we're going to pass. So apparently that's how this thing was part of the reason why this thing fell apart, because there was a professor on campus who kind of understood the value of these teams as opposed to maybe some other people involved. So.
Yeah. Well, what do they say? Those who can't do teach.
I mean, yeah. Apparently.
I know. I'm kidding. In all seriousness, though, this is an example of why oftentimes, and this is why, like, not to get into a tough discussion about like where our society is, but unfortunately, we've gotten to a point where we allow philosophies and ideologies that are a lot of times being taught in school to then dictate to all the people that are listening right now, that are actually out there working, that are actually doing the job, that are actually like impacting the economy, right? We allow this like think tank or academia to try to portray like, oh, well, this is how things should be in the real world. No. Like a lot of the people who are in logistics, who are in trucking right now, who are listening to us, they see what happens in the economy before anyone else. They're the ones taking and shipping different things out. They know what it costs. They know how much, gas prices going up. They understand, how much, how much they're needed, how little they're needed, whatever the case may be. They see all of that. Not some guy in an ivory tower sitting in a classroom who's talking about what he thinks or what he sees from afar. And unfortunately, that's where we've gotten to, is we had such poor leadership in the Pac-12 that we relied on someone who was so out of touch with figuring out what, like, again, and this is like Zillow. Like Zillow, for example, your house says it's worth whatever Zillow says, right? Whatever their algorithm says, okay? You know what your house is actually worth? It's actually worth, when you put it on the market, what someone's willing to pay you for it. That's the actual market value. No different than right now when we talk about running backs in the NFL. And however, so, well, this guy's rushed for this many yards, he's caught this many passes. Well, okay. Well, is any team willing to sign him to a deal that compensates him what he thinks he should make? No. They're willing to pay him what they're willing to pay him. That's his market value. And so, because the leadership in the Pac-12 was so poor and instead relied on someone in academia to come up with whatever that number they think they're worth, someone who probably has no idea what's happening in the broadcast cable industry, to come up with numbers or concoct some plan, it actually, instead of them getting the jump on the contract that, by the way, the Big 12 ended up accepting, right? Brett Yormark, as the commissioner, accepted that $30 million a year deal. And now look who's standing and look who's not. So to me, it's a combination of poor leadership and relying not on people who are actually, and consulting with people who are actually in the TV broadcast industry, and instead rely on academia. Like, again, I'm not trying to get on a soapbox to go on some sort of philosophical, spiel here, but there's a lot of people out there listening who are probably thinking to themselves, like, yeah, like we're better in touch with what's going on in the real world than a lot of people who sit in a classroom and lecture to kids, especially at the college level, and are telling them about. It's like, no, unless you're applying the real world experience. Like, it's all just a thought. It's all just your opinion. It's not actually what's happening out there in the real world. And that was, unfortunately, the demise of the Pac-12, or at least part of it.
Jeez. That's a tough one. I mean, I can understand why you would try to trust somebody who's educated on a higher level to give perspective or to give you, advice, consultation on it. I just find it odd when something isn't going the way it's supposed to necessarily go. It always goes away from the people who have always made the decisions to someone else. It's almost like scapegoating. It's like it didn't work, so we can blame it on this professor. Like, we're not going to blame it on the Pac-12 officials or anything like that. We're going to blame it on a professor that really nobody outside of maybe his people in his class or who does his office hours would even remotely care. I just think it's interesting how it's always kind of a pivot, from being bold and saying, here's what we're doing and this is how we're moving, to this is the reasoning as to why it didn't work. It seems outlandish to me. It also seems like there's more here. Like, I think if there were deeper digging into the scenarios that were on the table and what was playing out and who were the major players in it, I think you asked the question, how much were they making when that offer came to the table? Like, is that a complete $30 million more per team? You know what I mean? Or were they already making a sum of money that would have said the difference was $5 million or $2.5 million? I would be curious, because if you got an offer for $30 million, if you got an offer for $20 million, and you're not bringing in that $20 million at the moment in time that offer came down the pipe, why would you go up $20 million more?
Right. Like, $20 million's there's a big gap there, like, between what you were told they'd be giving you and what you think you're worth.
So it's almost like you want it. It's like you want it. If this is true, it's like you almost want it to sabotage the opportunity. That's what it sounds like.
I don't know if it's they wanted to sabotage the opportunity. I just think, again, it speaks to the lack of structure that the Pac-12 had in being able to determine its own market value. Like, I understand that because of the structure of the Pac-12 network and the Pac-12 conference, that it's heavily relied on the commissioner and obviously the university presidents. But how you internally don't have someone who's responsible for saying, this is what's happening in the TV industry, in sports, live sports. This is what's happening. We are unfortunately not able to be a part of what has now become the biggest window, and that's the noon window. Whether people know that or not, that is now the largest viewing window on Saturdays in college football, since college football is driving all of this. It's not prime time. Prime time actually had been dwindling. And in fact, before prime time, it was the 3:30 window. Usually that CBS has held.
Yeah.
And so since Fox has taken on this big noon kickoff, big noon Saturday, it's now elevated the noon game to surpass what has been the 3:30 window. But those are the two biggest windows. And so on the West Coast, it ends up being somewhat of an afterthought, because you tried to excel in thinking that prime time was still a big thing in college football on Saturdays, and it's not. And you could have seen that coming if you ever followed the numbers on Sundays, because prime time was at one point the most watched, Sunday Night Football, the most watched. And then you start to realize that the biggest game in the 4 p.m. window started to take over a lot of those ratings. So you could have seen all of this coming. But instead, you didn't have anyone internally that could help you figure that out. And instead of relying on people and consulting with people who are in the industry, who are actually out there in the field, working the job, who have real-world experience, you relied on someone who concocted some formula or algorithm to spit out what you thought each school was worth. And you overshot it by so much, you made it such an easy decision for the Big 12 to say, we know where this is going, and we would rather have a deal in place with two networks that will allow us to have national exposure and give us $30 million per year. That'll be towards the end of the deal, close to $50 million, while you guys are trying to now sit on your hands and have nothing to go, nowhere to go. And the schools are just looking for safe harbor. I keep going back to there's a faction of people in this country right now who are probably like in the real world saying like a lot of what's being spewed, it's not real. It's not what's actually happening in the world today. And this is an example of that in the Pac-12 with the lack of leadership and lack of internal structure.